This is BBC One, and now Jerusalem, a personal history, written and presented by Michael Frayn.
This is the way the Jews first entered the land where they were going to settle. From the east, through the great rift valley at the bottom of the world, 100 fathoms beneath the surface of an absent sea. This is the way that Jesus came in the last days of his life, up from Jericho, through the Judean wilderness. It's the way the Muslims came to crown their conquest of the Holy Land 600 years later. As you climb up from the valley floor into the desert hills 3,000 feet above, the land is as empty now as it was then. Until you come over the last bare ridge on the skyline, and there in front of you is a city, as sudden and unlikely as a mirage. Jerusalem. The center of the universe. The countries of the world cluster round it on the old maps, just as the sun and the stars in their turn revolve around the earth. And the old maps are right. Jerusalem is in the middle of the world. If you come up to Jerusalem from the west, from the coast, from the airport, you come through trees and vineyards and villages. The city's on a weather frontier. There's a little rainfall on these western slopes of the Judean hills.
Jerusalem is where the settled agricultural west comes face to face with the nomadic pastoral east. On the dry side of the city, Asia. Over here, Europe. This is Jewish Jerusalem. Familiar suburban streets. This could be the outskirts of some comfortable German or Austrian city.
As you get closer to the center, in some of the older settlements that date back to the 19th century, you get the impression not so much of familiarity as of hallucination. This rather nice piece of Victorian Gothic is plainly somewhere in the home counties. People have brought Europe with them, stone by stone. This is a village in Bavaria. Now we're in Moscow.
Now we're in a little town on the edge of the Russian Empire, in the Jewish Pale of Settlement. From the clothes and the language that people are talking, which is Yiddish, and the life of pious poverty they're leading, I'd guess we're elsewhere in time as well as place, somewhere about the middle of the 19th century. Now we're back in the second half of the 20th century, and it's almost as strange and unlikely as everything else. What's it all doing here? Jerusalem has no raw materials, it has no industry, it's not on the sea, not in the river.
It has just one economic resource, one invisible asset. It has holiness. It's the holiest city in the world, the only one that's holy to 3 different religions. These unworldly people in their beards and robes and poverty may look somewhat out of place in a modern city. So would coal miners in downtown Manhattan. They are, in fact, the primary producers who keep it all going. It's a curious resource, holiness. It's as intangible as the financial skill that's always said to be London's great asset. But for a few moments each day, the holiness becomes almost visible. As the day begins, first of all, when the sun comes up over the Mount of Olives and the stones of the city give out their own light. "3,000 years of stored sunlight, or the incandescence of some inner process. Holiness.
It's difficult to locate the source of all this energy. It seems as all-pervasive, as superabundant as the sunlight itself. Up here on the Mount of Olives, you sometimes feel a little dizzy with it.
Christ left his footprint in the rock here when he ascended into heaven. The Crusaders built a chapel over the footprint. The Muslims, who also venerate Christ and the Jewish prophets, turned the chapel into a mosque and offer camel rides.
How much is this? This book $9. How many want? No, I don't. Remember, Mr. Cash. Remember. You found this gentleman. I got him too. Remember, Jesus said right here.
Muhammad left his footprint in the rock on the other side of the valley when he ascended into heaven.
Muhammad hadn't risen from the dead, of course. He'd flown here from Mecca one night on a winged horse. And when the Messiah descends from heaven to lead the Jews into their eternal home, this is where he'll set foot on earth. These graves will open and their occupants will emerge. All the Jews who are buried elsewhere in the world will have to tunnel their way here for resurrection. Traditionally, they were buried with sticks to help them in the digging.
And the Messiah will cross the valley of Kidron here and enter the ancient walled city at the heart of Jerusalem through the Golden Gate.
The Muslims have blocked it up, allegedly to keep him out. They've also put their own cemetery in front of it, because they expect the Messiah to be a Cohen, a priest, and priests or their descendants are forbidden by Jewish law to enter a cemetery. The Jews don't think he'll be a Cohen. They think he'll be a descendant of King David. And the Jewish temple, destroyed by the Romans 1900 years ago, will come down from heaven and be restored at last to its rightful place on top of the chief Muslim mosque.
That's quite a lot to believe all at once. But there's something about this clear desert light that challenges you to believe. The sun stares down at you like someone fixing you with his eye. Do I believe it? I believe it's a good thing someone believes it. If they didn't, this extraordinary hillside would be just another housing estate, or just another patch of the desert. Because something happened here. An idea came up out of the desert and took root. A new God was introduced to the world. The old private God of the Israelites, the single God, the God of contracts and punitive clauses. It turned out to be an innovation almost as irresistible as capitalism or gunpowder.
A kind of magnetic field reaches out from Jerusalem, drawing pilgrims like particles from the ends of the earth. Jews at this time of the year to keep Passover, Christians to celebrate Easter.
Welcome, drink.
But this great magnet induces a strange and powerful charge in some of the particles.
Abel, welcome. Fadalu, fadalu.
The effect has often been beyond anything the skeptic could have anticipated. Take the Crusaders, who first beat out the path towards the city walls that these monks now follow in all humility behind their escorting major domos. The Crusaders had to fight their way here. It took them 3 years. At the urging of one of their priests who'd seen a vision, they processed right round the walls of the city with bare feet and penitent hearts.
Many of them had come on the crusade because they thought they were on their way to the New Jerusalem, the heavenly city of Revelation. When they finally broke their way in just around the corner here, what did they do? They slaughtered everyone. They slaughtered the women, they slaughtered the children. It took them all afternoon and all the following night. They accepted money to spare the lives of people who'd taken refuge among the great mosques, then slaughtered them anyway.
They burnt the Jews alive inside their synagogue. That's how the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem was born. And that's pretty much how it was kept going for the next 88 years, until Jerusalem was lost again, by a continuous process of slaughter and intrigue throughout the Middle East.
The name Jerusalem, according to some people, is derived from the Hebrew word shalom. It means the city of peace. Let's go in.
New York is always supposed to be the great melting pot, but inside these walls, it's more like a nuclear reactor. It all looks very peaceful at the moment, but throughout history, people have gone crazy as soon as they got in here. Before the Crusaders, there were the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Persians. Then there were the Saracens, the Tartars, and the Turks. They nearly all slaughtered everyone they could lay their hands on. The whole pile has gone critical over and over again. But then the radiation in here is very intense. This is the heart of the holy city. These stones bear witness not to legends, but to real historical events.
Good morning.
I'd like to show you the station of the cross.
How much did you charge?
It's up to you, because there is 14 station, take 1 hour, show you all the places.
Okay.
I want to show you the chapel of flagellation, where our Lord put at his head the thorn of crown, and also where the Roman soldier sacrilleged him, whipped him.
There you go.
Now we enter inside, I'll show you.
This is the Via Dolorosa, the way of sorrow that Christ followed from his condemnation before Pontius Pilate in the Antonia Palace, which stood here, to the place of the crucifixion. The exact location of each event along the way is marked.
See here, the fourth station of the cross, here where Jesus met his mother, Holy Mother Mary. And you know, also this chapel, it's built by Roman Catholic Franciscan father before 90 years, you see. Now we continue to see the fifth station.
So you can look round and see exactly what Christ himself saw.
Here, a book of the Via Dolorosa, the 14 stations.
By the way, this
They
is
give
very
a good
interesting.
information.
It's a booklet that shows you the 14 stations of the Via Dolorosa.
Well, not the souvenir shop, of course.
And you can see his hand, where put it here. You can put your hand here. You can see
Not the buildings, because these have all been put up since it became an Arab city after the Crusaders were driven out.
procession, and all the pilgrims, they touch it because they believe it. You know, this as tradition, you know.
Not even the street. Because the holiness of Jerusalem has had a funny effect not only on its devotees, it's had a funny effect on Jerusalem itself. It's eaten it away. Nothing in this ancient and venerable city is quite what it seems. It's difficult to find anything still above ground that was here when anything happened. These walls are not in fact the ones breached by the Crusaders. Those were taken down by the Saracens. And the walls the Crusaders broke through were not the walls that enclosed Jerusalem at the time of Christ. Because 40 years after Christ's death, the reactor got out of control and there was a complete meltdown. The Romans dismantled the entire city down to ground level. They ploughed it. They laid it out again with a new street plan. The only things here now that Christ could have seen on his way to be crucified are paradoxically the most mortal and transitory ones. These women, these children, this dust kicked up by passing hooves, that and the sky and the clear desert light itself. The holiness, just like radioactivity, must have seeped into the ground. Archaeologists digging 2 stories below the level of the present city have uncovered the remains of a secret Christian church. It may have been built here because this rock was the hill on which the crucifixion had occurred. The Romans certainly covered the site later with a temple dedicated to Venus, perhaps as a kind of early lead screen. Then, 200 years after they destroyed the city, the Roman Emperor Constantine was converted to Christianity. His mother, Helena, came to Jerusalem just in time to see the true cross being discovered in an underground cave down there to the left. The Christians removed the Roman temple, and Constantine at once covered the ground again with a church of his own, replaced by the Crusaders with the present structure. So the top of the hill, Calvary itself, is now indoors, up this staircase. This is where Christ died, somewhere among the lamps over the altar. The silver ring in the floor marks where the cross was planted. It's all like a parcel in gift wrapping, except that this is a permanent parcel, a gift that can never be unwrapped. This is the stone of unction, where Christ's body was laid out to be anointed. The centre of the world, by the way, the exact Piccadilly circus of the medieval universe, is just beyond those lamps. An extra layer of stone, a church within a church, covers the tomb of Christ and the spot where the angel announced the resurrection. We're a long way from the sky in here. There isn't even any natural light.
And like I was explaining before, Jesus was a Jew and he couldn't be buried on the Shabbat. You understood that? So Joseph of Arimathea gave his own tomb for Jesus, right? And this is the tomb, and it was divided in a way typical of the Second Temple time, which was two rooms, one for the morning and one for the actual sepulcher.
But this isn't the actual place where Christ resurrected.
According to the Catholic Church, this is the place where
Mary Magdalene came on the morning and he was gone, and he had risen from the dead.
That's right. And the stone that you see inside is the actual stone on which he lay.
Everything has changed since the time of Christ. In fact, it's all changed since the time of Constantine. This isn't the original chapel. That was burnt down in a fire that gutted the whole interior in 1808. It was started by a drunk monk who tried to put it out by pouring aqua vitae over it. But then the whole church had already been destroyed by the Persians. Everything in Jerusalem is at least one stage further off than you think. Though that doesn't stop holiness being given off. This is the sepulcher itself, where the holy fire comes down from heaven in a miracle that occurs still every Easter Sunday. But all this holy radiation seems to produce mutations in those exposed to it. If you look round the back of this chapel, you find another chapel also giving access to Christ's tomb. A different sort of priest and another contribution required because this is a rival concern. These are the Copts.
Put your hand into touching. Head the tomb of our God. It was touching too.
What is this?
Yes.
What is it?
Head of the tomb. Breathe. Cross. You got money for a change. No.
There are two more chapels behind the tomb. One is in ruins because the Syrians and the Armenians can't agree how to share the cost of the repairs. The other because it's disputed between the Armenians and the Copts. The Armenian church also has a second Golgotha, because the first one was expropriated from them by the Georgians, who were in their turn expropriated by the Greeks. Some of the Protestants have a third Golgotha up behind the bus station. This one was discovered in 1883 by General Gordon of Khartoum. The 5 different Christian sects who share the Holy Sepulchre have always fought like cats. In fact, the struggles between the great powers who supported them were one of the causes of the Crimean War. Part of the peace treaty that ended that war was an agreement to observe the status quo in the holy places.
But what is the status quo? Who owns what? Who is allowed to process where and when? It was left to a British civil servant, Mr. L.G.A. Cust, to try and describe the situation. His report was published in 1929 when the British ruled Jerusalem, and it's remained the official handbook that guided first the Jordanians and now the Israelis. It runs to some 70 pages, and it makes fascinating reading. For instance, the steps leading up to the Chapel of St. Mary's Agony, that's these steps, are Latin property. The question as to who was to clean the lowest step, which is barely above the level of the courtyard, was in 1901 the cause of a sanguinary encounter between the Latin and Orthodox monks. In fact, it's a classic of descriptive prose. I quote, more or less at random, "The ledge above the slab," this is the slab over Christ's tomb, "is divided between the 3 rites, Orthodox, Latin, and Armenian. The center portion is Orthodox, the left angle is Latin, and the right angle Armenian, while the 2 projecting ends are Orthodox." One encouragingly ecumenical note, though: the great latrines are common property. It's like a marketplace in there. It's like the bazaar outside. Well, not quite. The bazaar is perfectly peaceful. Once upon a time, there were more than 5 sects sharing the holy places inside Holy Sepulchre. The Georgians, the Nestorians, and the Maronites. They weren't rich enough to stay the course when the Turks ruled the city. It was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a poor sect to pay the exactions of the Turks. And then there were the Ethiopians. There still are, in their own little African village up here on the roof of Holy Sepulchre. That's the lantern over the bit where St. Helena found the true cross. The Ethiopians are the saddest story of all. Once they had a foothold downstairs with the Big Five, but they lost their documents, like the old tramp in The Caretaker. They went in a fire in 1838. The Ethiopians claimed they were burnt by the Copts, while they themselves were temporarily put out of business by the plague. It's like Chicago down there. Better to be up here and out of it, I should have thought. The Ethiopians aren't quite as innocent as they look. In 1970, they slipped down the back stairs here, grabbed the chapel off the Copts, and changed the locks. The Israeli government is still sorting that one out.
Joseph of Arimathea, being disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him leave. He came therefore and took the body of Jesus, and there came also Nicodemus, who brought was a mixture of hair and blood. Then took the body of Jesus, on it little soft, spices, and
unto the place Golgotha, which is being interpreted the place of a skull, and they crucified him. Jesus, immobilized on the cross, still loved, still offered forgiveness, and so we pray, O Lord Jesus Christ.
One God, a simple idea, a universal principle. But what the whole history of Jerusalem demonstrates is that the simpler the idea, the more different ways there are of seeing it. And the more universal the principle, the more divisive it in fact turns out to be. The nature of Christ alone has offered more possibilities for fission than the nature of uranium, and in the end led to more cataclysms and more deaths.
The Orthodox Church took the view that Christ had both a spiritual and a physical substance. The Nestorians believed he was purely physical, the Monophysites that he was purely spiritual. The Orthodox Church persecuted the local Monophysites with great enthusiasm. That's why they were so ready to convert when Muhammad's followers arrived with a less complicated creed. Loudspeaker worship.
Anyway, that was the center of the world. Though Christ himself wouldn't have seen it like that, because when he died there, it wasn't even in the city, it was outside the walls. That's why they took him there to be crucified and buried, because it was ritually unclean ground. It was the unholy backyard of a holy city. It wasn't Christ who brought the holiness to Jerusalem. It was the other way around. It was the holiness of Jerusalem that brought Christ.
Christ was a Jew preaching to Jews. and the Jews poured into Jerusalem at Passover on the annual pilgrimage to the centre of their world, the temple. This was here in Christ's day. It's almost the only single object left above ground in the whole city that was. It remains the one Jewish holy place. This is where the Israelis rushed when they captured the old city in 1967. To the western wall of the temple, the one fragment left of the Jewish city destroyed by the Romans 1900 years before. The Israelis have turned the back street into a large open square more suitable for a holy place. But even these few authentic original stones are not as straightforward as they seem. The holiness has seeped a long way through the earth to get into them, because this isn't in fact the wall of the temple.
It's the wall that holds up the platform of ground on which the temple used to stand. The holiness was in the stones of the temple itself. Or was it? The temple was built by Herod, who was a half-Roman puppet king. His temple was Roman. He rebuilt Jerusalem as a Roman city. You can feel the weight of Rome bearing down in this reconstruction by archaeologists. There's even an amphitheatre for wild beast shows and gladiator fights.
Pious and patriotic Jews loathed it all.
And no sooner was it up than it was down again. 6 years Herod's temple lasted. It was blown up by all the holiness it was trying to contain. Holiness has an unfortunate effect upon the impious as well as the pious. It brings out a certain schoolboyish naughtiness in them that puts the pious in an even more murderous frame of mind. When the Romans captured Jerusalem, the first thing Pompey did was to go into the Holy of Holies in the temple, where the high priest himself was only allowed on one special day in the year. He just wanted to take a peek. The Syrians, when they were occupying Jerusalem a century before, felt obliged to put a temple to Zeus up there and to dedicate it with the sacrifice of a sow.
This time, the trouble started at Passover. All that holiness took its toll on a Roman soldier who pulled up his tunic and farted at the worshippers. There was a riot, and 30,000 people got crushed to death. That's how the great Jewish revolt against Rome started. It ended with the Jewish fanatics shutting themselves up inside the temple and emerging only to slaughter and pillage like Christians. The Romans had to destroy the place to get them out. And when the Jews revolted again, 65 years later, the Romans wiped Jerusalem off the face of the earth. They drove out the Jews and founded a new city with a new name. We're not looking at Jerusalem at all. We're looking at Aelia Capitolina, a pagan city dedicated to Jupiter. So naturally, on the spot where Herod's temple stood, there is now a mosque.
Why a mosque? Well, why a temple? Why did Solomon build the original temple here 1,000 years before Herod? Because this ground was already holy. This is the Mount Moriah of the book of Genesis. And on the rock inside this elegant and harmonious building Abraham once made dutiful preparations to slaughter his son.
What is known by the name mihrab. This praying corner points the Muslim believer to which direction he has to face when he's praying.
When Muhammad's followers arrived in 638, ragged from their campaign of conquest, the whole Temple Mount was littered with debris from the last disaster to hit Jerusalem. The city had been taken by the Persians 24 years earlier, and they'd sacked it and massacred the inhabitants like everybody else. The Jews are supposed to have ransomed some of the Christians so as to have the satisfaction of carrying out the slaughter themselves. Now it was the turn of the Arabs to sack and massacre.
But an odd thing happened. They didn't sack, they didn't slaughter. They behaved with bizarre tolerance to Jews and Christians alike. Well, it was a new religion, they didn't know how to behave. But even after the Christians had taken the city 4 centuries later and left the Temple Mount now literally knee-deep in Muslim corpses and blood, they still didn't take the hint.
When Saladin recaptured the city in 1187, he behaved with the same unholy generosity. Not a building was looted, not a person injured. But the holiness of the Temple Mount still casts its spell. At Easter time in 1982, an American Jewish immigrant ran amok up here and shot 2 Arabs dead and wounded 20 more. And in 1968, an Australian Christian set fire to the other great mosque up here, Al-Aqsa. Now Jerusalem is Jewish again. In Mea Shearim, they are burning all the last traces of leavened bread before the Passover, and the Jewish pilgrims are flooding into the city just as they did before they were expelled 1800 years ago. Or almost.
Kids come here to sing Manishtana. Manishtana.
These people are celebrating the traditional Passover Seder at a hotel in West Jerusalem. The song they're singing is one they've sung on Seder night for years of exile. Next year in Jerusalem. When you're already in Jerusalem this year, hoping to be here next year may seem unduly cautious. The history of Jerusalem being what it is, though, a note of caution is not entirely out of place. And of the city they've come back to, one equivocal wall, and a piece of ground being held up by it that's too holy even to be walked upon. Keep off. Radioactive.
It looks like some early nuclear power station too, enclosed in those high blank walls. But is it really the centre of the world, the source of all that energy? The odd thing is that Jerusalem has moved. It used to be over here.
This is Mount Zion, well outside the walls to the south of the city. Perfectly respectable part of town. Hats on here, in fact, because this is a synagogue. It's the tomb of David. Shoes off here, this part's a mosque. Hats off again here, because this bit round the back is a Christian holy place. It's the room where the Last Supper was eaten.
Up to the 11th century, Mount Zion was inside the walls.
For centuries, the city has been creeping away across the hills to the northwest.
This part of the city is withered away. It's been left behind like a great man's humble origins. Once, the walls used to come right down to here. This pool, where Jesus cured the blind man, was the city's water supply. That's why Jerusalem was here in the first place. Or at any rate, in the second place. Because this water wasn't always here. Shoes off again. And socks. It comes out of a man-made tunnel in the hillside, and you can trace it back to its source. And the source of the water is the source of Jerusalem. This tunnel was a very early civic amenity. It was built by King Hezekiah, 700 years before Christ. Jerusalem was being besieged by the Assyrians under King Sennacherib. Hezekiah wanted to cut off their water supply by blocking off the original spring and diverting it to the new areas back there that Jerusalem has spread into. The tunnel twists and turns through the hillside for over 500 yards. We're going roughly east, then back to the north again.
It's like retracing the path of some strange, slow-moving organism. This is where the city is today, inside its Turkish walls. This was the shape of the city when the Crusaders captured it, before Mount Zion got left behind. And in Christ's lifetime, when Calvary was still a wasteland outside the walls, in the 6th century before Christ, when it was sacked by Nebuchadnezzar, 4 centuries before that, when Solomon built the first temple up there on Mount Moriah, and this is where Jerusalem was before it set out on its travels, 1,000 years before Christ.
This is the original spring. This is where the water that first gave Jerusalem life actually comes out of the rock. And this is the original Jerusalem. This is where King David set up his capital. There's still a little holiness in the ground, even out here. Or so some of the Jewish fundamentalists think. They come out here and try to stop the archaeologists digging. But it wasn't a holy city when David captured it. Because he didn't build it, he took it off someone else, just like everyone has since. It was an obscure little hill fortress on the edge of an obscure wilderness. The Kidron Valley was 40 feet deeper then, and this precipitous hillside, with its own water supply from the spring, was a natural defense system. That's why it's here.
It was a little town of 2,000 or 3,000 people, something like this Arab village on the other side of the valley. It belonged to a rather obscure tribe called the Jebusites, with a rather obscure god called Charlem. Charlem didn't do much for the Jebusites. They just sat here defensively for 1,000 years and then got knocked out of the league by Jehovah's team. The only thing Charlem ever did that anyone can remember is to give his name to this place. Jerusalem is really the city of Charlem, not the city of Shalom.
What David did was to bring the holiness into Jerusalem. He brought it from this little village 5 miles away, just off the main road from the airport. It was something invisible, inaudible, intangible. It was being carried on a cart, so it can't have been, much more than about so wide by so high. Now this invisible, inaudible, intangible import was invested in an object called the Ark of the Covenant. No one knows exactly what the Ark of the Covenant was, but it served as a shrine, and it was where God maintained his symbolic residence. It had been through the desert with the Israelites in a tent. It had been captured by the Philistines, but they'd sent it back because it had raised tumors in them, exactly like some source of malignant radiation.
Now at last the Israelites had some fixed abode, a city to live in, and God could take up settled residence.
This was what the temple was built to house. This was the seed of the modern Jerusalem coming into town. You couldn't see the shops or the filling stations then, of course you couldn't hear the traffic. But then you couldn't see the source of all this power. It was like transporting some early nuclear weapon. As one of the men who was guiding the cart discovered, they came to a piece of rough ground, and the ark began to rock about. So this man, whose name was Azar, put out his hand to steady it.
And God struck him dead.
It's David who comes out of the story best. He was, says the Bible, displeased, down tools, and refused to move the ark into Jerusalem for another 3 months. Not until God had showered blessings on all concerned, like the Atomic Energy Authority paying out compensation.
But when the ark finally came into Jerusalem, David went wild with religious ecstasy. The emotional atmosphere has remained charged ever since. So there was the holiness in Jerusalem, and there was Jerusalem at the center of the world. The center of the political world. That's why all the old maps put it in the middle, because the prophet Ezekiel says in the Old Testament that God set Jerusalem in the midst of the nations. Palestine is on the land bridge between Asia and Africa. It's what historians call a debatable land. Somewhere that's knocked back and forth in the endless debate between the great empires that surround it.
It was part of Syria, it was part of Egypt, it was part of Rome. For 4 peaceful, corrupt, dull provincial centuries, it was part of Turkey. Then it was part of the British Empire. This is the old British High Commissioner's house. Now it's the headquarters of the United Nations force who are supervising the truce around Israel. Nice location. Terrible address. It's called the Hill of Evil Counsel.
The British didn't plunder or sack. They just promised the country to both the Arabs and the Jews.
So when they went in 1948, the debatable land was debated once again. And this time, Jerusalem didn't end up on this side or that side of a frontier. It ended up with the frontier right the way through the middle of it. I don't think the center of the world is back there in the Holy Sepulcher. I think it's here in this old bandstand, because this is the old no man's land. West Jerusalem and the commercial center, that was all in the state of Israel. East Jerusalem and the Old City, that was in the Kingdom of Jordan. And this weird scar still runs right the way across the city. It's like some huge, ominous crack in a nuclear reactor.
It's all patched up again now. In 1967, the Israelis took East Jerusalem, and the debate moved elsewhere. As far as the Israelis are concerned, at any rate. Jerusalem is the eternal and undivided capital of the Jewish state, without possibility of change. That's what Begin said, and that's what the Jerusalem Act of 1980 lays down as well. The result is that the city's on the move again. It took 3,000 years to creep from the spring of